So, what if the world as we know it actually had a prophetic schedule? Well, today we're diving into a really detailed timeline of the end times, all based on the Grace for Purpose Ministries interpretation. We're going to walk through the sequence of events they lay out and break down what they believe it all means. So, the source material paints this picture, right? In the time leading up to all this, the world is just normal. People are grabbing their morning coffee, they're on their way to work, streaming shows, completely wrapped up in the day to day. And this total sense of normalcy is actually the backdrop for a sudden world-altering event that's described as happening completely without warning. It's this stark contrast between the totally mundane and the absolutely momentous that really kicks this whole thing off. The very first event in this prophetic timeline is something known as the rapture, and it's presented not as the final end, but really as the dramatic beginning of a whole sequence of world-changing judgments. Now, the source is really clear on this. This is not some gradual process. It's an instantaneous transformation. The idea comes from a passage by the Apostle Paul, which describes the dead being raised and the living being changed in the blink of an eye, rising up to meet Christ right there in the air. So what happens on earth? Well, it's described as just catastrophic, bewildering chaos. I mean, imagine pilots just vanishing from planes, drivers disappearing from cars. The source paints this picture of global panic, where scientists are completely baffled, and people who are left behind suddenly realize what's happened, flooding into churches in total despair. Okay, and here's a really crucial distinction the source makes. The rapture isn't the final return. It's just the first of two phases. It's presented as an event for believers to take them out of the world before something called the Tribulation. The second coming, that comes later. It's an event that happens to the world for judgment and to set up a kingdom. So right after the rapture, this timeline enters a 7-year period of divine judgment known as the Tribulation. And it all kicks off with a series of judgments that are symbolized by 7 seals on a scroll. And you're gonna see the number 7 pop up a lot. In the source's view, it represents biblical completion. So you've got 7 years of tribulation, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls of judgment. It all reinforces this idea that this is the final, complete end of an age. And these judgments begin in a pretty epic way, with the opening of that scroll, which unleashes the famous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The first, on a white horse, is interpreted as the Antichrist, a deceiver. He's followed by war, then a devastating famine, and finally, a rider literally named Death, who, along with hell, wipes out a quarter of the entire world's population. And from there, the source says things just keep escalating. The 5th seal reveals martyrs in heaven crying out for justice. The 6th unleashes this cataclysmic earthquake that physically moves mountains and islands, plus these terrifying cosmic signs. And then, the 7th seal brings this dramatic pause, a half-hour of total silence in heaven. But that silence, it's really just the calm before the next storm. See, the opening of the 7th seal doesn't end the judgment. Instead, it introduces 2 more series of 7 judgments, and each one is harsher than the last, the trumpets and the bowls. The 7 trumpet judgments are described as a systematic attack, first on the natural world, then on humanity itself. 1/3 of the earth is burned, 1/3 of the sea becomes blood, 1/3 of the fresh water is poisoned. Then, demonic locusts are let loose to torment people for 5 months before a massive army comes and kills another 1/3 of the world's population. But here's something that's absolutely wild, and it's a key theme in the source material. Despite all this escalating horror and supernatural devastation, the people who are left are described as just hardening their hearts, refusing to repent. All right, this brings us to the final series of judgments, the 7 bowls. And these are described as God's wrath poured out in full. So unlike the trumpet judgments that affected 1/3 of things, these are total. All the seas and rivers become blood. The sun scorches mankind. And the final judgment ends with the greatest earthquake in history and a voice from heaven declaring, "It is done." So after laying out all of this unbelievable destruction, the source makes a really interesting pivot. This whole apocalyptic timeline isn't presented just as some future horror story, but as a message for us today. The focus shifts from what will happen to the question of how we should respond now. And this leads to a question a lot of people have, right? You look at the world today with wars, famines, earthquakes. And you have to wonder, are these the signs of the end? It's the same kind of question Jesus' disciples asked him.
Well, the source points to this teaching and explains that, according to Jesus, these events, wars, disasters, they aren't the final signs themselves. They're described as the beginning of the birth pains. So the real message isn't about creating some kind of prophetic checklist, but about learning to endure faithfully through a very troubled world.
And this all leads to the source's final and maybe its most challenging point. The focus shifts away from judging the world and turns inward, toward this moment of self-examination for believers themselves. The whole message wraps up with this really thought-provoking passage. It's this idea that judgment isn't just for other people out there, but that it actually begins first with those who claim to be faithful. It's framed as a divine standard that starts right inside the church. And that right there is the core challenge of the entire message. It's a final gut check question that turns the lens away from just watching for signs out in the world and points it right back at us. The ultimate question isn't, when is all this going to happen? But am I truly ready?